Container-based RWD with element queries is the name of this talk. But things have changed a little bit in the last 6 months when I submitted this. So container queries are another name for element queries. So this talk is more or less renamed element-based RWD with container queries. It was nice I could just make a quick swap on the title. Anyway, I'm Philip Zastrow. I work at Sparkbox. We're a web shop out of Dayton, Ohio. We do a lot of cool things. See sparkbox.com if you want to check out some of the stuff we're writing. So it's been about 3-ish years since I've actually been presenting in front of people. I've normally been doing these online things. So since I actually have an audience that I can see and see how they react, I'm going to talk about myself a little bit. So I like watching television. I particularly like Netflix, and my wife and I love watching just documentary type things. And the one that we've been really hooked on lately is PBS's How We Got to Now. It is this really cool just exploration of all these things that we're just used to today. Things like time and light and sound, these things that we just kind of take for granted. The fact that most of us can have a watch in our hand, or at the very least we have the time in our pocket, and we can always know what time it is. And this aspect of time and what he goes through has just been really fascinating to me. So you may know this fellow. This is Galileo Galilei. He is a very renowned astronomer, having discovered things like moons going around Jupiter. But before his days as an astronomer, he was a choir boy. And while he should have been sitting, probably paying attention and whatnot, his mind was wandering. He started observing little weird things like how the light would swing. Not only would he notice that the light would be swinging, but he noticed that there was a rhythm to it. It had a constant motion. And that little observation he recorded, and it kind of made its way around, and eventually, some time later, it made its way into clocks. These things that we know as pendulums. How many of you have been out to the, not going that way. How many of you have been out to the Griffith Observatory? Yeah, I went out there for the first time yesterday. Beautiful place, amazing scenery from up there, but in the middle of the building, they have this pendulum. And it's just so cool to see it moving back and forth as it's going with the rotation of the Earth. And it's just fascinating that this thing that is actually kind of showing us the rotation of the Earth is what was just observed through this light that was swinging and made its way into a clock. And now we can all tell the time. And it's really cool. But a few hundred years ago, 150 years ago, 100 years ago, we still needed a way to base all of our time off. How did we set those clocks? We based it off the sun. Where was the sun in the sky? And that is completely relative to where you are, right? So here we are, we're in Long Beach. It's 2:05, according to our clocks, but the sun on over towards Hollywood is a little further along, and so they're going to say it's 2:10, right? And if you're basing your clock off of the time, this was a common problem, and as you go from town to town, the times would vary slightly. And so you get there, you'd have to reset your watch and so on. Train came along, this is a big problem, especially as you need to make a transfer on your trip from New York to Philadelphia, and let's say you make a stop in the middle and their time is different. And so and the train happens to be going on Boston time. So you have 3 or 4 different times that you're dealing with, all within 5, 10, is this not working?
Higher a little bit.
Oh, sorry about that. Oh. Should I flip it around? Maybe. Is that better? Oh, okay, good. I'm sorry about that. So back to the story that was really riveting. We needed a way to kind of standardize time, and what do we have? Time zones. So time zones were actually what developed because of this disparity in time throughout the country and needing some way to follow trains along and as people are trying to transfer. I mean, imagine flying on out here and you have a connecting flight and you know it's supposed to leave at 9 a.m. and you get there and it's already gone because it was 9 a.m. the time zone or the time that you got into that city. Time zones are kind of rough, but imagine it being varying by minutes all over the place. Be crazy and nuts. So order was brought through time zones. And I don't know, just kind of looking at all this and thinking about it, I was just like, I'm thinking about how did the web get to now? What is our story kind of looking like? And we're looking back on it, and the major thing that I'm still seeing is responsive web design changed the whole landscape of making websites. And we were all kind of doing our own little thing as far as mobile websites and so on. You know, if I go back even further to the beginning of my career, I know that I was so excited about 800 by 600. And like that was the way that you made websites. If you wanted to look great, it was 800 by 600. And then I was like just chomping at the bit for my boss to let me go to 1024 by 768. And when I got that was the best day ever. Because I could finally start making websites that looked really great because I could do 1024 by 768. And life went along like that for a good while. We were making 960 grid-based things, and that was all nice, and they looked great, and they were pixel precise, right? And then Ethan came along and wrote his book. And you know, we learned about the fluidity of the web, the flexibility of the web. But the thing that just like struck me, and I think it struck plenty of others when it came to reading that book, was it changed my thinking about things. And that was a big piece of it all, is that we change the way we think. We have a different way of thinking about the problems, about what we're approaching. And very much like the train, right? The big thing that came along when the time zone was trying to be implemented across the country was cities were up in arms. They were saying that their time is the right time for their people. They don't need to have some standardized time throughout the country and throughout the whole area. And so here we are now, as several years later, after responsive web design has come on the scene, and we recognize that our medium is fluid. It can be infinitely expansive. And all of this is done through the power of the media query. And with the media query, we can do so much. It is absolutely incredible. The thing is, it was already there, right? The media query wasn't something that Ethan Marcotte developed to sell responsive web design. It was already there. He brought order to some chaos through just showing how the media query could be used in a new way. So now we can make websites and things that just look amazing on really old phones, newer phones. Like we can assume that it's going to be really great when it comes on out, tablets, so on. And that just kind of now, that's where we're at. So what's next? What's next in the evolution of the web? And part of it, we've already started to see flexible images. We are seeing the responsive issues community group do amazing things in pushing source set and picture. So with source set, we can set alternative high resolution images based on screen density. And with picture, we can start doing art direction with our images so that we have better images that fit the design at that specific size. So what are container queries? I've been spending all this time not talking about them yet, right? Well, I'm going to go into another question. What's wrong with media queries? And in part, is there something wrong with media queries? I'm talking about how powerful and amazing they are. The thing is, they are kind of limited. They're limited into the information about that particular screen that we're looking at. That's all we really are able to know about what's going on. So we're going to take a phone here, and what can we find out about this through some media queries? Some very, very useful information. We can find out the width and the height of it, its resolution, which is very cool, aspect ratio, and even the orientation. We can know if somebody has it in landscape or portrait. And those are all great things, and we can do amazing, amazing design changes based off of that information. And so here's kind of how we typically would use a media query. So we're starting off small screen, so we're going small screen on up. So our CSS is pretty basic. This is what we want to do for this listing of articles, and we want our image container, this gold area, to be 20% wide when it's at this size. And then as we get on bigger and we're at a larger screen, we set our media query. So here we are, 60 EMs width. We want to make that image take a bit more space, so we set it to 35% width. So what happens if we are going to go and just take that HTML that's setting up that list of articles and move it over to that sidebar? Verbatim, just move it on over. It's okay. We've got fonts that are a little, like text is really getting a little large for that space. The image is probably a bit larger than it ought to fit for that area. It would really look a lot better if we could have that small screen view when we're looking at this sidebar. And with all that information that we are getting from media queries, we are incapable of knowing the width of that container, whatever the width of those elements are. And we can't make changes based off of that. So what do we have to do right now? We've got to go back, refactor our CSS, rescope it based off of where it's going to be, or maybe I should have rewritten this entirely so that it only ever is the small view and then add a modifier class to make it bigger. And it's just, it gets to be a bit of a headache as you go through and try to refactor everything. And we have to adjust all these styles based off of where it lives and scope our CSS. And so that's where container query comes in. We can use the same HTML in both areas and allow it to change its format and styling accordingly. So we are basically able to allow an element to contextually modify itself based off of where it is in a layout. We don't have to worry about the layout itself kind of dictating things, but allow that element to be choosing what it should do and what it should look like based on where it is in the layout. So where our media query is very broad, almost sun-like, right? When the sun in the sky, if we're trying to gauge the time of day and we don't have any type of way to tell the time, we can look at the sun and get a pretty good idea. But clocks allow us to be very specific and very precise. I mean, today, our clocks are all looking towards a particular central computer that is looking at an atom and how it is pulsing. It is that specific of time, and that's what all is coming to our phones. And that's just nuts as far as time tracking is so precise. The container query brings precision, not quite to that level, probably stretching it, but it's pretty precise. And it's kind of awesome that we can have that type of control. So why does the container query matter? And if all that other stuff that I said wasn't selling you, I think one thing that I really, really love about it is atomic design. If you're not familiar with atomic design, it's the idea of setting up your HTML in such a way that it's very reusable. So I know we've had some talks about modularity already, but atomic design, let's say I have a search bar, and there's components that make that up. I have an input field, and I'm actually going to go ahead and jump on over here to try and illustrate this. This is Pattern Lab. If you're not familiar with Pattern Lab, wonderful tool put together by Dave Olson and Brad Frost. An atom, you'd have your smallest piece. It's an HTML element of some form, input field. A molecule would be bringing an input field and a button together. And now we've got a search field, right? Well, we want to reuse that in multiple places, so we have organisms, and organisms are collections of molecules. And so we would have a header molecule and a footer molecule, maybe a sidebar molecule, or organism, sorry. And with those, we can just continually repeat and reuse the same HTML all over the place. So we only have to make changes for that in one area. Very nice for rapidly building new pages. And that's, I think, what's really great about it. And as you start finding patterns that really work out well and can reuse them in projects, you can just pull those on in and plug and play, basically. I kind of can't believe I just said plug and play. So my example is we can not only use the same search field markup, but we can use it throughout the whole site, anywhere that we would need to use a search field, we can use that same molecule. So atomic design makes our HTML modular and reusable. That's what I see container queries bringing to CSS. We can reuse the same CSS in multiple places and not have to worry about redesigning and reworking it based off of
its location in the layout, as we so often do. So a slide I forgot to change, container queries in action. So here's a site we put together, I put together earlier this year on the Best Picture nominees of 2015. Was able to go ahead and point out that there's, which movie won and so on, and looks really great. Small screen, got it in a list view, back to a grid view when it's larger, but we're getting ready to come up on the 2016 nominees, right? And so we want to go ahead and make room and put that in that big space and move the 2015 nominees over to the right side area. Just try to be a little preemptive. We're starting the work now. And if I were to just move that HTML as it is into that sidebar, because my media queries, it gets a little messed up. Can no longer really tell. It's still holding on to that grid view because of the screen size was all based off of that grid or that media query. And so to kind of show you, I'm going to be dangerous and have a live demo to some degree. And this is a little smaller of a screen than I was thinking it would be, so we'll see how this goes. All right. All right, so CodePen on 800 by 600 is a little interesting. So we might have to zoom out. That'll do. Okay, so I've got the exact same HTML in both the left-hand side and the right-hand side. And as I modify the size, it just works as you'd kind of expect, I would say. When we hit a certain size, that sidebar's too much, we're going to move it on down below the main content. And if I scroll on down, because of the size, it's at the grid view. So that element is at the same width as the main content element, so it gets bigger and therefore goes to the grid view. And if I were to just keep on taking this on down, we go to a 2-column grid view and then eventually the list view. And that list view is on all of them because they're stacked in the same width. One other thing that you can do that I'm just fascinated with when it comes to element queries, and I'm hoping you can see it all right up there. It's contextual design that you can do that is kind of awesome. So as space allows, we can add more context to what we're talking about. So in this case, we have where it says Best Picture winner, or on below where it says who directed the film. As I scale it on down and it starts running out of space, it flips. So now instead of saying Best Picture winner, it says 2015 winner. I was able to swap out, using a pseudo element, the text that actually shows up because the space didn't really allow for that to show the whole string terribly well. Additionally, I removed the directed by because it's understandable what that is, but having the space and adding in that context was kind of nice. So we can kind of change what information we have on there to make it clearer based on the space that's available. So to go this a little bit further, kind of went through with the Sparkbox Foundry and did something similar. And we can see the same things going on. We have on the left-hand side, it's a big column and then a sidebar over on the right. And that looks to be all I can zoom out, so you don't get to see the big pretty version when that gets wider. But what I also have going on down here is a footer. And that's the same HTML that's going on up above. So in this footer, I'm removing basically what I have set is the smallest screen, or smallest size that this element will ever be, only shows the title. And then as it grows, we add in more information. So the title is the main thing that we want to use, and then we can start adding in the image and who wrote it and when they wrote it. And so this is just in the footer, same HTML, but I'm using a CSS column to break it up and constrain it, so it just shows as a list. But I can kind of take this a little bit further and at small screens, if we get down there. we can pull that content on down below it, and instead of it looking the same as the content above because of the width, I add a CSS column there as well that puts it in 2 columns so that it just has a better look and feel. I'm also mixing media queries and element queries with this to deal with where the layout ends up. So as I'm growing the screen and we're going from a single column to 2 columns for the whole layout, that's happening with a media query. So just because you're using element queries, it doesn't mean that media queries aren't useful or powerful. In fact, I would say you almost need them working together. So, the slide that you already saw, that was a really neat demo. I want to start using element queries now, right? So here's the little bit of bad news. Element queries do not currently exist as an accepted standard. You probably would have heard about them long before if they did, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's the case. At how long have SVGs been around? So we got to do this through polyfills. If you are not familiar with polyfills, that pretty much means fake it till you make it. It is JavaScript powered. I must slide ahead. But it is our way to use container queries today. They are JavaScript powered, which means we need to have JavaScript in order for it to work. However, what I like about a lot of these approaches is it basically becomes a small screen fallback. So if JavaScript doesn't load for whatever reason, you're not without styles. It'll still look okay and be usable. Another really cool about polyfills is not always, but depending on the implementation, they can have really great browser support, which means that browsers as far back as like IE8 can have element queries. So that's kind of a nice benefit that once, if it becomes standardized, that won't happen any other way. So if you're interested in polyfills and element query polyfills, Tyson Matanich on Smashing Magazine a couple of years ago wrote and just kind of talked through a lot of things to take a look at and think about when it comes to polyfills. So some of the polyfills actually are proposing particular formats that may or may not be accepted. And so they're kind of interesting. EQ CSS is one of those. And it stands for Element Query CSS. And their approach is to create an @element. And this is actually what you would put in your CSS, and then their JavaScript would read through the CSS and look for this @element. And so you'd have element, and then whatever the name of the element is, your selector, in this case, a class of content, and then whatever the width is that you want to watch for. So you want it to be a min width of 40 em to change the background to blue, in this case. Fairly simple. What's really cool about EQ CSS is this other feature of minimum characters, or min characters. So you can actually watch and make changes based off of how many characters it counts along the width of that container. So in content, I want it to add a minimum of 30 characters in its count, change the font size to 75 em. So that way you can start resizing content based off of how much room you have with text. Another one I just learned about fairly recently is container queries polyfill, a new word to me. Polyfill being probably going to be accepted as the actual standard polyfill. Kind of a long name. So with the polyfill, the idea is that this is most likely what's going to be picked up. Don't really know if that is the case from what I've seen, but it is kind of an interesting concept. And so this treats it as a pseudo selector on top of your container, your selector, and then you would use width is greater than whatever it is that you want it to be. What's interesting about this format is it can be more than just width that this gets applied to. So in this case, I have text align equals center. And so then it would only apply those changes when I have its parent container having the text align to centered. So it means that you have some even finer grain changes that you can make to your styles based off of the location of that element in the layout. So if I have this large main area and the sidebar, and one of those has text-align center, the changes would only happen when it's in that container. One thing about these is more or less this is invalid CSS. So if that is something that is very concerning to you, it tends to be for me, it's something to just play with, experiment with, but probably not really ready for production code. But depending on your needs, it may work out just fine. So I'm going to get on a slight tangent, because this is just one of those other things I just find amazing and cool and love. So most element query polyfills, content query polyfills, I meant to get every slide and I missed them, but they rely on the attribute selector. And if you're not familiar with the attribute selector, let me tell you about it, because it is some cool stuff. So we have in our HTML data-key, and that's just a data attribute. But in my CSS, I can put square brackets with whatever the name of that attribute, data-key, and then I can apply my styles accordingly. And so it'll attach everything there. You can get even deeper, make it so that only when it equals that particular value. So data-key equals CSS Dev, only apply it then. And even crazier, it can look at list, comma-separated list, or space-separated lists that will find if one of those terms match and apply the styles only there. And that's the big one that a lot of these use, is it basically, a lot of these polyfills just add in a string of values to a data attribute, and then they're called upon in the CSS. To get a little further on attribute selectors, Chris Coyer put together a very nice rundown in CSS tricks, because you can go way deeper on element or on CSS attribute selectors, and I probably could have had a talk on that. So, all right, enough of the tangent. Element query, Tyson Matanich, this is what he introduced in his Smashing article. His, along with Mark J. Schmidt's CSS element queries, both kind of follow the same format. It basically looks like this. You put into your CSS, you only are ever working in your CSS with these. You put in your selector, and then in brackets, your min width, and then you would put in 400px. And that tilde means that it's part of a space-separated list. So 400px, somewhere in that list that it dumps into the DOM, will get those styles. So that's kind of your way to do element or content queries today. Other one is put together by Sam Richard, who I think is here, not in the room, but at the conference. He put together eq.js, and that's one that I actually really like, but it's kind of the more complex of the options. So with this, we have data EQ points, and this is what we're going to put into our HTML when we're writing it. And we'll put in small for 400, or small equals 400 and large equals 900. And then what the JavaScript is going to do is it's going to watch that container. It's going to go through and find all the containers that have this data attribute and watch their width. And if that width ever matches some of the keys from the equal points, it's going to update it, data equal EQ state. It's a tongue twister for me. And it's going to update it with small and large. And then in your CSS, you're going to put the selector name. In the brackets, you're going to put data equals EQ state small. And that caret there actually means that the small is showing up at the last one, right? Now I'm confusing myself. I heard first, so now I'm confused. So it should be that it's the last one in the list. So the next one should be large. The tilde actually I find works a little nicer too, because that just gets anything that's in there because it just is broad. That's where I'd suggest looking into the attribute selectors, because you can do a lot with this. But this is the baseline of what you need to know. So the JavaScript is watching the HTML and watching the DOM elements, and then adjusting your CSS would adjust the styles accordingly. This is actually in use right now, eq.js on the Weather Channel. They're using it all over the place. A good part of it is being used on the actual areas where they show the weather, but all their news stories are using it as well. CNN.com is using it. They're using it for that main feature story as well as their listing of stories. They're on the right-hand side. So it's kind of cool to actually see it in the real world. And here's the list again of the polyfills in case you missed any of those links. Definitely worth checking out. I highly recommend just playing around with EQ, CSS, and the container queries polyfill just to see, what are the cool possibilities that you could do with this, and as this gets more refined, could it, what kind of fun could we have? So, state of content queries today. So, responsive issues community group have been big pushers of container queries lately. In fact, I think they renamed themselves. They used to be Responsive Images Community Group. They renamed to Responsive Issues kind of about the time they picked up element queries. And their suggested format was very similar to what you saw in the polyfill with the container, but instead it was media. And so it's set up to be circle, so I've got a circle that I want to change the background of, orange to blue, when it gets to a certain width. And so I would set up my selector, media, and then min width of 40 EM to change it to blue. So when it hits that size, it goes to blue. The problem is we can do this with widths, and this is where the container piece starts coming into play. Before it was element, so you could actually put and have the watch of an element query on that particular element. So I have this particular item that once it hits a minimum width of 40 EM, I change the width to 30 EM. And so with that, we start getting an infinite loop. And so that's where we needed to start looking into, instead of having these based off of the elements themselves, based on what is containing them. Matt Marquis, a couple months ago, went in depth on a list apart with container queries, just explaining what all progress had been made with element queries to date, and that problem was just too large to overcome, that some of the writing of what does it mean for us to use these changed a bit to be container queries. I would really, you can totally get into those infinite loops with these polyfills, and so definitely would exercise caution in how you're using them as you get those into place. So that's pretty much how things got to now with where we are with container queries, where the web is going, and what kind of cool things we can be doing. I think that the container query is a natural progression of responsive web design. I think it makes probably some of the most sense. Just as I think source set and picture made a ton of sense for images. And while these are not standard, totally very useful today. And definitely in practice, we at Sparkbox have used it on a couple of projects, and I have one project I'm on right now that probably twice a week I'm thinking, I wish we used element queries on this one. It would make the project so much easier. The big thing definitely is to be diligent and intentional. The reason I like EQ.js is it forces you to use multiple places so that you know exactly where you're putting element queries, and you can't really get too carried away. You can get carried away, but it helps rein things in a little bit. So what else do they need? They need you. They need you to get out there and start messing around with them, experimenting. We need people to see the slight observations, the things that are a little, don't seem quite right or seem kind of interesting. We need people to start taking the next steps, start implementing some of these observations. And really that's all coming through experimentation. And we need you all to experiment and contribute and file bugs and take a look at the use cases that Responsive Issues Community Group has put together and see where are their pitfalls. And then big thing is have fun. Just enjoy playing around with some new technology. So, thank you.